Shalltear is the strongest floor guardian. I've said this many times before in many different videos, but never really got into the details as to why that is. Is it her abilities, her build, her equipment? What is it exactly that ranks her above the rest? Well, let's do as we usually do and analyze every single one of those aspects to see if we can answer the question in the title by not actually answering the question at all. How strong is Shalltear? But first, a quick reminder that the Succube and Nabe merch are still available in the link in the description. Oh, and if you're a fan of the maids, then I may have something special for you coming very soon. But anyway, let's begin. Unlike most of the other NPCs, whose builds were designed primarily for roleplay purposes, Shalltear doesn't really have a consistent theme going on with her race and class. Well, aside from what we discussed in the earlier videos. After all, power gamers are focused on exploiting the mechanics of the game to build powerful combinations, not thematically consistent or coherent ones. And as you know, Pararonchino was a massive power gamer. So much so that Shalltear's build and equipment rank her in the lower portion of the top tier of all players, and if equipped with a full assortment of divine class items, she would have ascended to that middle portion of that upper echelon. That ranking would have ascended even furthermore if she had multiple sets of divine class gear, allowing her to change and adjust in order to match her opponent, in which case she would likely have been among the strongest in all of Yggdrasil. Of course, the skill and intelligence of its user also play a huge factor in how strong a particular build is, and as I've said before, Shalltear is kind of dumb, and in practice isn't nearly as strong as her build would suggest. After all, Ainz did manage to beat her with his borderline role-playing build, despite all its disadvantages and drawbacks relative to Shalltear's. But regardless of her intellectual capacity, let's take a look at what exactly her kit consists of. First off, Shalltear is a vampire, a creature of the night whose lore you now know all about, but their mechanics still remain vague. So to begin with, vampires are actually a kind of undead creature, and since Overlord borrows from Dungeons & Dragons so much, we can use those D&D undead mechanics to sort of set the groundwork for what we're dealing with here. The undead are animated by negative energy. They don't necessarily move using their own muscles or brain, which, fun fact, skeletons have neither of. Their senses such as sight or smell don't necessarily work either. Instead, undead physiology is inherently magical. Whether or not they have physical features such as eyes, they can still see perfectly, even in the dark. Regardless of whether or not they have a brain, some can think just fine, though often lesser undead are just mindless beasts. And whether their form contains muscles or some otherworldly matter, they can still move very easily, though the way that they move is dependent on the type of undead. But I think you're getting the bigger picture now. It's because of these unique traits and unusual physiology that undead gain a broad immunity to many different mental and physical effects. They can't be magically compelled, frightened, poisoned, diseased, paralyzed, stunned, weakened, or even have their morale increased or decreased, and the list goes on. It does make sense though, since they are already dead, most mindless as well. Many effects that would normally debilitate humans would have no meaningful effect on them. It's just one of the many perks of being an undead race. Another would be their ability to make critical hits, lethally damaging blows, and sneak attacks essentially useless. I mean, if you try to pierce the heart of something that doesn't have one, then I don't think anything's gonna happen. Just ask Clementine, she knows. These types of attacks are pretty much nullified by the very negative energy that powers their existence. It's directly in contrast to the positive energy that grants living creatures life, meaning that healing spells or magic that channels positive energy to the target would actually damage undead, and damaging spells that deal negative energy would actually heal them. For example, many undead such as Ainz have special drain abilities that they can activate when they touch their opponent, and if that opponent is living, it steals their life force, then proceeds to turn it into the negative energy that fuels them. It would also follow suit that undead are usually immune to the negative energy effects of others, whether they be from other undead or just negative energy based spells. The only notable unique interactions undead have with any other classes are when it comes to dealing with clerics. Depending on the kind of energy a cleric channels, which is determined by whether the deity they worship is good or evil, it gives that cleric the ability to either rebuke or turn undead. Depending on the strength of the caster, the effects of their spells could range from causing the undead to run in fear, mind control them, or even just outright destroy them. It's all dependent on the cleric's spellcasting ability. And yeah, a cleric can bypass the undead's natural mental resistances. Anyway, for the most part, these various properties and interactions transfer over to the undead and Overlord, as well as Shalltear. Broadly speaking, these general principles remain the same, though the specific details could differ a little bit. As you know, Overlord tends to be fairly vague when explaining its mechanics, but what we do know is it usually lines up exactly with Dungeons & Dragons. If there were any changes, it tends to be in the form of additional mechanics on top of the existing set, rather than removals or significant modifications. And it's not like they didn't mention repeatedly in both the light novel and the anime that undead like Shalltear and Ainz enjoy a large selection of immunities to various effects thanks to their undead race. I mean, part of the reason why Ainz was so taken aback when Shalltear was mind-controlled was because he presumed she would be immune to it. Only a powerful item, like a world item, with the power to literally change or overcome the rules of the world itself, could have affected her. And, as it turns out, that's exactly what it was. Similarly, Shalltear and Ainz can't heal themselves with traditional healing magic, well, since it damages them. Instead, if that rare occasion where they somehow took damage did occur, they'd have to use negative energy spells to regain HP. This is also generally true for most of the undead in Overlord. But Shalltear isn't just an undead, she's a vampire, meaning a heteromorphic class with access to a full racial class tree and job class tree. Though Shalltear doesn't quite have a heavy investment in that racial class side, with only 20 levels assigned to it, specifically 10 levels in Vampire and another 10 in True Vampire. But let me tell you, those 20 levels really adds a lot to her kit. Now, in mythology, though the specifics often depend on the story being told, vampires tend to share some common properties. They're said to be difficult to kill without specialized tools or techniques. Their eyes have magical powers that affect the minds of others. They can transform into bats, wolves, or other nighttime predators, and even create and control lesser vampires. The list goes on. Many of these vampiric properties actually carry over to Overlord, though the nature of the vampires themselves have tweaked a bit in Yggdrasil. You see, they're kind of a supernatural bat-human hybrid. Lesser vampires look roughly humanoid, being mostly human and slightly bat-like, whereas true vampires are these hideous, monstrous-looking creatures. In this manner, they're much more similar to the bestial monsters from, say, The Witcher, than they are to the regal and pale-faced vampires of Dungeons & Dragons or Castlevania. As a matter of fact, Shalltear's transformation back in Season 1 was actually her reverting to her normal appearance as a result of going into this berserk frenzy. It's not clear, but perhaps her ability to modify her appearance into a pretty little girl is a result of the inherent transformation abilities of vampires. Then, as you'd expect, unless a weapon is made out of silver or has certain magical properties, their innate damage reduction will nullify most physical attacks. You may see this as an unfair advantage to classes that rely heavily on hand-to-hand or sword-based combat. But from a PvP perspective, this wasn't necessarily a strong ability. There were many other abilities that were similar to this, so it became customary for most players to bring a large assortment of weapons and spells with a variety of damage types into a fight. Some even took the time to carefully gather intelligence on their opponent in order to bring whatever countermeasures they deemed necessary to the fight. It's understandable why they do such a thing though, because if an opponent failed to sufficiently prepare for the encounter, they'd have to contend with not only the inherent damage reduction of a vampire, but also their rapid regenerative ability, one that can slowly heal even the most lethal of wounds. Just look at the vampire brides during the assault on Brain's bandit camp. They were caught in bear traps and impaled by spiked pits, yet still came out relatively unscathed. Not to mention the physical abuse that they take from Shalltear on a daily basis. So I think it's safe to say that they're fairly durable. Vampires also have what's called the Mystic Eyes of Domination, a special ability that allows them to mind control anyone who makes eye contact while the ability is active. Direct mind control magic like this tends to come in two broad forms: Charming and Domination. Charm tricks the opponent into thinking of you as a very close friend, and while it does give you a lot of ways to manipulate them, they wouldn't do anything for you that they wouldn't do for a good friend. By contrast, Domination enslaves the person to your command, forcing them to follow your every order, as demonstrated by Shalltear on the adventurer Britta. Now, in Dungeons & Dragons, vampires could summon a host of minions. Overlord takes this one step further, and they allow high-leveled vampires to summon waves of powerful vampire bats, rats, and wolves. Summons like these are effectively the manifestation of an abstract idea of the creature. You don't call forth a specific creature from another dimension. No, Rather, you pull forth its fundamental essence, and that essence forms into a similar shape as that creature. Therefore, summons don't actually die when they are killed. They dissolve back into the essence from which they came, and if you summoned it again, you'd get another copy of the same creature, but it'd have no memories of its past existence. While Shalltear does have access to these powerful mana-efficient summons, they are still only temporary. Her vampiric horde, on the other hand, is created by a limited-use ability called Summon Household. Using it doesn't consume mana like her normal summon spells, but she can only use it a certain amount of times per day. As for these summons' actual strength, they're generally a lot weaker than the being that created them, both offensively and defensively. Though the stronger that you make your summon, the less of them you can do per day, and vice versa. That being said, they wouldn't really be meant for beating your opponent, more like used to harass and distract them. Maybe if it's a drawn-out battle of attrition, you can even use them to gradually drain your enemy's health and mana. But most importantly, while Yggdrasil prevented friendly fire, there is no such limitation in the New World, which was demonstrated rather cleverly by Shalltear when she sacrificed her own minions to activate various abilities. Now let's move on to a more classic vampiric ability, one that drains enemies of their blood and heals themselves in the process. Normally, a direct bite to the neck is required, but in Shalltear's case, one of her classes actually exists to improve these capabilities, which we'll discuss a little bit later. What's relevant right now is that creatures who die from such blood loss become lesser vampires that fall under the control of the vampire that created them. And finally, Shalltear has the ability to transform. Like I said earlier, her normal appearance is probably just a transformation, but it's not limited to those few select forms. Presumably she can also turn into a bat or a wolf, or perhaps much more powerful vampire versions of them, but there really aren't any specific details on that. She can also take the form of mist, which is something we saw her do against Aninews. Though her mist form isn't actually true mist, it's rather something more akin to the form of a ghost. She projects her being onto the astral plane, and only items and abilities that can influence the astral plane are able to affect her. Now, you're probably thinking, what even is the astral plane? Well, it's a parallel dimension to the physical world. In fact, it kind of overlaps it. It's effectively the plane of ghosts, spirits, and souls, including the souls of both the living and the dead. Even inanimate objects like collapsed great cities or giant mountains that have toppled with time can exist as ghosts within the astral plane. What this does for Shalltear is it gives her a potent invulnerability tool that can be used as a counter to many different kinds of attacks. I mean, being able to slip into mist form at any time and completely avoid most attacks is incredibly useful. It forced Aninews to select only instantaneous spells, or those which could strike the astral plane. Alright, so we've talked about all these crazy abilities associated with her vampire class, yet we've yet to see any weaknesses. While most heteromorphic creatures had glaring weaknesses to compensate for their considerable strengths, it's not clear exactly what weaknesses vampires had to balance all the power that they have. I mean, traditional vampires can't enter buildings without an invitation, they can't cross running water unless inside their coffin, and they pretty much dissolve if kept immersed in running water for a long period of time. But for the most part, it would seem that those weaknesses don't apply to Yggdrasil vampires. One that she does inherit from the traditional vampire is their weakness to sunlight, but not to the effect of immediately disintegrating by the slightest touch of UV. It's more of a moderate speed debuff. You personally may not think much of that, but even a small debuff like this could heavily sway the decisiveness of a battle. Thus why Aninews decides to engage her in broad daylight. Of course, normally this weakness wouldn't be an issue at all for her, since the majority of her duties involving fighting should, for the most part, take place in the catacombs, far from any direct contact to sunlight. That being said, it wouldn't be surprising at all if there were at least a few spells that could invoke the power of direct sunlight to blind and burn enemies. In Shalltear's case, it would act as a mana-efficient trigger on her sunlight weakness that would only mildly inconvenience her. But perhaps one of the biggest weaknesses of vampires was their blood frenzy passive ability. Something similar to insatiable bloodlust, but times 100. The more Shalltear was covered in fresh blood, the more her urge to slaughter and kill would rise. She would become more reckless and aggressive, increasing her offensive power, but she would also lose control over her actions and fight more recklessly as well. In Yggdrasil, this took the form of an offensive buff and a defensive debuff, and probably also made it so that her AI stopped following orders and just ran around killing enemies. But in the New World, where orders for the NPCs are more complicated than simply stand here or attack this target, and where Shalltear needs some degree of self-control to execute them, well, it's a pretty debilitating effect. All things considered, and after the events of Season 2, Shalltear actually has to learn how to fight without getting blood on herself. After all, it was this passive that caused her to lose control over herself back in Season 1, which ultimately led to her defeat. But yeah, that's pretty much everything related to her vampire side. There's still the rest of her classes to go through, her abilities related to those classes, then her equipment. So we're really only about a third of the way done. You can expect at least a 20+ minute part 2 of this coming out soon, and maybe even a third one. Actually, yes, probably a third one, but hopefully those aren't too far off. Anyway, before I go, Succube and Nabe merch links are in the description. And feel free to join my Discord as well, where we're starting a new season of Waifu Wars, complete with prizes for the winners. And a quick PSA, because I'm also looking for people who have read the Shield Hero novel just to help out a bit with the cut content series. So if you've read the novel and you want to help out with that, then yeah, feel free to join the Discord for that too. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!